Good morning and welcome to the Pathways Research and Training Center's February 24th webinar, Stepping Up, Successful Advocacy by Youth and Youth-Led Organizations. I'm John Osowski, Dissemination Manager for Pathways, and I'd like to begin with a few housekeeping announcements. Please see the advice on this slide to make the most of your go-to meeting experience. In particular, please note that during the presentation, all audience members will be muted, but you can send your questions to us via the chat feature. A recording of this webinar, as well as a PDF version of all the slides, will be made available online shortly after this webinar ends and will be available from the link shown at the bottom of the slide. That's www.pathwaysrtc.pdx.edu/webinars-previous. We'd also like to invite everyone who registered for this webinar to stay in touch with Pathways RTC by signing up for our monthly RTC updates. We feature links to Pathways like this webinar, as well as news of interest to the field. You'll receive an invitation via email after the webinar, and we hope that you will accept it. This webinar is made possible through funding from SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, and NIDLR, the National Institute on Disability, Independent Living, and Rehabilitation Research. Without any further ado, welcome to today's webinar, Stepping Up, Successful Advocacy by Youth and Young Adult-Led Organizations. And at this time, I'd like to invite our panelists to introduce themselves. And Nancy Korloff, would you please lead us off?
Yes, thank you, John. I'm Nancy Korloff, and you're now looking at a picture that shows all four of us. I'm going to let each of the panelists introduce themselves, but I want to just mention that Barbara and I and Nicholas are all part of a project called Systems/Policy Analysis and Change. It's the policy research project within the Pathways Research and Training Center. So Barbara, I'll start with you.
Hello, this is Barbara Friesen. I work on we call it SPAC, Systems Policy Analysis and Change Project.
Hello, I'm Nicholas Bouquet. I'm a research assistant.
Bree?
And I'm Bree Masale. I'm the Director of Technical Assistance and Evaluation at Youth Move National.
Okay, back to you, John.
So now that we've had a chance to introduce our panelists, let's try to introduce our audience and have a couple of polls. The first poll I'm going to put up now. And you should be able to see it and interact with it. So Nancy, if you'd be so kind as just to read the choices people can have while the voting takes place.
Sure. So we want you to choose the one statement of the following that most closely describes you. Are you a youth or young adult with lived experience? Are you a parent or guardian of youth or young adult? Are you a service provider working with youth or young adults? Are you administrator or service supervisor? Or are you a person doing policy work? And that might be a legislator, a policy analyst, someone at the state level. We want you to choose the one that most closely describes you. We know some of you will be in more than one category.
Great. And just give a few more seconds here. We'll be closing the voting here in about 5 seconds. Most people have voted, so I'm going to close the poll now. Let's see the results.
So 18% are youth or young adults with lived experience. Welcome. We don't have anyone so far that's a parent or guardian, but people may join us. 32% are service providers, 29% are administrators, and 21% are people doing policy work. So we have a nice spread of people who either are involved as youth and young adults or who could be supporters for youth and young adults who are doing policy work.
Great. And let's see about our second poll. I'll be launching that.
Okay, and here we'd like you to tell us what your connection or your relationship is to youth and young adult-led organizations. So you can choose as many as you want on this. The first one is I am a member of a youth-led organization. The second one, I provide consultation and or I support a youth-led organization. The third one is I provide material resources to a youth-led organization, and this could be funding, it could be space, it could be copying. The next one is I promote the work of a youth-led organization to others. And the final one is none of the above, but I'm aware of the work of these organizations. So you can choose as many as you want of these.
Great. And let's leave just a few more seconds. We do have a majority voted, but let's see if we can get really high voter turnout here. Great. I'm going to close the poll now. Thank you for voting. And I'm going to share the results.
And there we are. So just like the first poll, we have 18% who say they're a member of a youth-led organization. 54% say they provide consultation and support. 26% say that they provide material resources. And almost another half of the audience promotes the work, and 23% who aren't involved in any of the above ways but are aware of the work. So I think particularly for that 23%, we're hoping that we'll be able to provide you with some additional information.
Great.
Okay.
So let's return to our webinar.
Okay, so this is Nancy, and we're going to jump into the content of the webinar now. Thank you for spending the time to give us that information about who you are. You see on the slide right now, you see the purpose of the webinar. And the main purpose is to talk about, to consider, to provide information about advocacy and policy change efforts in the youth mental health field, specifically those change efforts that are spearheaded or led by youth and young adults. Primarily, one of the main features of this webinar will be a discussion of a study that we've done in which we've interviewed youth-led organizations about their successful advocacy efforts, particularly on making policy change or changing the system in some way. Next slide. These are our learning objectives, and the first one I want to emphasize particularly the critical nature or the importance of having youth voice in policy change. I think you'll see comments about this throughout the presentation. Barbara will provide a working definition of policy and also talk a bit about the policy process model that we've used in this work. We'll talk about the study, the purpose, the methods, and the findings, mostly the findings. And then we'll end with some recommendations that come out of the interviews, plus some resources. Next slide. So starting right in with the methods. The first question you may ask, and many people ask, is how did you find these organizations? And it took us a fair amount of work to recruit, mostly just calling people and talking to them about who they knew. Youth Move National helped us a great deal in terms of giving us names and contact people, particularly of their chapters, but of all kinds of organizations that they knew of that had involved themselves in policy change. We have a young adult advisory panel for the project, and we talked with them about who they knew or would suggest that we contact. We asked all of our colleagues and many of our youth experts around the country for ideas. We pasted it on Facebook, thanks to Nicholas's work. And then as we talked with or interviewed study participants, we asked them who they knew was working in the field, or was doing policy change in mental health or child welfare or a related field. We did a pre-interview with everybody that was nominated that we could get in touch with. And in that pre-interview, we talked with them specifically about their organization. We wanted to make sure it was a youth-led organization. And then about the policy change activities that they'd engage in. And out of that, we selected usually one, sometimes two policies for them to be interviewed about. It also allowed us to figure out, some organizations are still in the process of developing the infrastructure or in the process even of doing policy change. And we tried to select, for the most part, organizations that had actually finished a policy change and could talk about the outcome and the implementation. Once we'd done the pre-interview and decided whether or not to move on to the research interview, we then worked with the organization to get any information that we could ahead of time. We looked at their websites, read the mission, read whatever it is that they had available to get ourselves familiar with the organization. Next slide. We then collected the data. We did face-to-face interviews. We focused, or phone. We did mostly phone interviews. We did a couple of face-to-face interviews with groups that were close to Portland and were able to come here. We focused on one recent policy change effort, and if they had more than one, and there were two organizations that did, we scheduled a second interview and then did the whole interview over about the second policy change effort. The interviews were audio recorded and transcribed, and then we did the analysis using Atlas TI, and mostly to organize and code the interviews, the transcripts. We tried to look for, mostly what we did in the analysis was to look for the answers to the questions we asked in the interview. But we also were looking for themes and quotations about things that, that came up that we hadn't necessarily directly asked. Next slide. And this is a summary of the kinds of questions we ask in the interview. We wanted to know, for the one policy issue that we were talking about with them, how did it come to their attention? How did they decide to focus on that policy issue? What process did they use to learn about the issue? How did their group make decisions to take this on? What partners did they work with, and what did those partners contribute? Did they have, for the organization, for the young people involved, any training about policy work? What were the ingredients for their successful outcome? And then what kind of recommendations would they make to other young adult organizations who want to be or are currently engaged in policy work? Next slide. Now I'm going to turn it over to Nicholas.
Hello.
Who's going to talk about the various groups that we organized.
That we interviewed. We interviewed 9 organizations from the East Coast to the West Coast. These organizations were focused on foster care, the justice system, or the mental health system. Our first organization is Facing Foster Care in Alaska. They work to extend foster care to age 21. Next slide. We interviewed Florida Youth Shine. They work to reduce barriers to foster youth's participation in normal activities. Next slide. Just Kids from Baltimore. They ended the practice of holding young people ages 14 through 17 who are automatically charged as adults in adult jails. Next slide, please. Oregon Foster Youth Connection worked to provide college tuition waivers for foster youth and created a foster care Bill of Rights. Next slide, please. Youth in Action in Washington. They worked on a peer support curriculum. Next slide, please. Youth Move Oregon, yep. They worked to increase meaningful young adult involvement. Next slide, please. Lummi Nation, based in Washington. They work to increase youth voice in foster care. Next slide, please. Bravehearts New York. They worked on a peer-to-peer navigator program. Next slide, please. And a work group in Maine They worked on continuous quality assurance, and we actually have Bree from that group who could talk to us a little bit more about it. Bree, if you would.
Great, thank you. So I'll just share a little bit with you about our project here in Maine. In 2005, I was the Youth Move Maine coordinator, and our system of care grant really focused on really shifting to develop a trauma-informed system of care. And as part of that, youth and families were involved in the development of a trauma-informed organizational assessment that 147 funded mental health, behavioral health organizations within the state of Maine were required to complete within their contract. So the youth and families worked really, really hard to add this new contract requirement into all behavioral health contracts. Once they completed the assessment, each agency received a report card about how youth-driven their organization was, how engaged families were, how they felt, respected within the organization, and it was really to help drive kind of changing that trauma-informed culture within each individual organization. After a few rounds of implementing at the local level within agencies that assessment tool, the state decided to convene a group of youth and families to look at the statewide data that came out of all of those mental health assessments. And the state of Maine looked at that, and families and youth were able to kind of start articulating like what would best quality look like and what were kind of scores that they would like to see agencies achieve, and what does trauma-informed really mean to families, and then create a process in which the state could hold them accountable. So the Youth and Family Work Group worked really, really hard. The hope was by the end of the System of Care grant that the Trauma-Informed Agency Assessment Tool would be implemented and sustained within the work, as well as this newly formed kind of state-level Quality Assurance Council, which was the first time ever that medical directors and the Quality Assurance Director and behavioral health directors were all in the room with youth and families and utilizing their voice to establish kind of quality outcomes for the services. And the effort went really great. They created a lot of really wonderful materials. They were able to do presentations to local service providers. And then our system of care funding came to an end. And as we were obtaining other funding to continue to sustain, we had a lot of leadership changes within our state. And through those leadership changes, we had our Division of Behavioral Health Services, who served as the lead in this particular project, was basically dismantled and merged within the Division of Department of Health and Human Services. And they did away with all of those state-level leadership positions and restructured completely under a new governor. So with the lack of historical context and knowledge for all of the leadership that was very supportive within this movement, the project kind of hit a standstill, and the new leadership never saw the value in it. So they continue to offer within the state of Maine the trauma-informed agency assessments as part of contract language, but they have not been fully engaging youth and family at the same level of defining quality. And youth and families have been advocating towards that, and they're starting to re-engage in more conversations about how youth and families can be at that level. So we're very hopeful under new leadership now that this work will continue back within the Department of Health and Human Services. The youth group has been able to take some of those quality measures and some of that information and move it into the juvenile justice side of our state system, but for this particular task, they weren't able to officially change legislation, but they continue to remain hopeful.
Thanks, Bree. I think Bree's discussion of that experience, I think, just suggests a couple things for us. One is how long sometimes these processes can take, and how sometimes you have to come back to them later, and also the changing nature in the environment can really have a lot of impact. We whipped through those last slides pretty quickly. There were 9 organizations that we interviewed. We'll try not to go quite so quickly through the next slides. But I do want to remind you that after the webinar, the slides will be on our website, so if you want to go back and get a name or read them more carefully, you should be able to do that. Okay, now I'm going to turn it over to Barbara Friesen. Next slide.
Good morning. Oh, sorry. Well, first I wanted to start with a definition that somebody named Cunningham gave us more than 50 years ago, and he said, policy is rather like an elephant. You recognize it when you see it, but cannot readily define it in advance. You're muted, so I don't know whether you're laughing, but I hope that you are. So public policy is, one of the definitions is a system of laws, regulations, courses of action, and funding priorities on a given topic. And when we talk about public policy, we're talking about governmental entities. Generally, when people talk about policy, we think about formal, written down rules and regulations, and this can be at federal, state, and local levels. But policy also exists at the agency level, and it can be either formal, agency policy, written policy manuals, rules and regulations, or it sometimes is informal or unwritten, and that's implemented through the actions of employees, not necessarily thinking that they're making policy, but often people do things because they've always been done a certain way, and people assume that that's policy, even though we can't find anything written down when we look sometimes. We didn't study any of these informal policies, but I think it's important to know that there's a lot of that, actually. When we were looking at the issue of parents having to give up custody of their children in order to get access to funding for residential care, we found many places where policy would have allowed them to do voluntary custody arrangements, but it was never done. Examples of important policies for young adults, I gave a few: housing, education, employment, student loans, child care might be another. I'm sure you can think of many, many others. Next slide, please. So there are many descriptions of the steps in the policy process, and also many diagrams of policy cycles. We have chosen this one, and although many of the policy steps and cycles use different words, the content is often very similar. So in this figure, the first step in this process is at the bottom in green, and called identifying the issues. So we just begin with figuring out what the problem or need is that relates to policy, what is it about, who is touched by the current policy, and who might be affected if the policies change. The second step, policy analysis, which is, oh, I said it was green, it looks kind of yellow, but anyway, policy analysis, which is blue, we dig more deeply into the questions raised in the first step, talking to people who are affected by the problem, looking at various policy possibilities, gathering research to learn about what has been tried and what the results were, considering issues such as cost as well as benefits to those who are affected by the policy and to society at large. Once decisions have been made about what seems to be the best direction for policy change, then in step 3, proposed bills or changes in agency rules or regulations are put together, and these policy instruments are the working policy documents for further work. The next 2 steps involve lots of work with people, your partners in the policy change, as well as those who may be reluctant or oppose our plans. In consultation, Discussions occur with a wide range of people and may involve public meetings, focus groups, or just having lots of conversations with a few people at a time. And the purpose of those discussions is to begin to sort of take the temperature of opinion and also to gather support. The fifth step, coordination. This would be once a bill is filed or the policy process is really moving along and you know who your partners are and you've got people lined up who are willing to testify and other people such as state agency personnel, people who need to be kept in the loop about how the change process is going. Lots of communication. Sometimes when we talk about policy change, we focus on the decision point, which is the purple blob. And when the bill may be considered by legislative committees, when they hear from people who have a stake in the outcome, people who come to give testimony, or sometimes they call in experts to give testimony. During this process, there may be amendments offered and eventually a vote. Often people think about policy change as that decision point, but there's a lot that goes on before and after. A similar process goes on at county and city levels. Agency change in agency policy is often less formal and doesn't involve as much activity and going back and testimony and all those things. So once a decision, so let's assume that we got the change we wanted and everybody voted yes. Once a decision's been made to change the new policy or to make a new policy, then it has to be implemented. And this is when the decision and the written down things that are in the policy itself supposedly get turned into actions. And this is a critical and really often a very difficult phase, partly because change is difficult and it requires lots of effort, and there may still be some resistance to change, to that particular policy change, but also because often there aren't enough resources or time, enough attention given to the implementation phase. There haven't been things built into the bill that would help to implement it. So during the implementation phase and ongoing, we would hope to have a good evaluation so that the outcomes of the new policy can be measured, and it's important to understand why things did work well or why they didn't go as we had planned. So we try to figure out, was the policy change a bad plan, or did the change just really never happen as it was intended? And the blue arrow at the bottom suggests that this evaluation may lead to adjustments and may uncover the need for a policy change process to start all over again. Next slide, please. So this is the same policy cycle, but it contains some examples from our study of activities from various phases by the organizations that we interviewed. And I'll just let you kind of look at those. You'll see we have quotes here from identifying the issues through statewide retreats. One organization began, actually the policy analysis phase began with a study. During the decision, a group from Facing Foster Care in Alaska flew to Juneau and went and met with legislators. And Bree actually talked about how the youth and families came together and created a continuous quality improvement card. And then one organization, only one, had an ongoing funded evaluation. Next slide, please. So I'm going to finish talking a little bit about the outcomes of the policy process. These are the efforts that the youth-led organizations in our study. Then Nick will talk about obstacles and also ingredients for success, and Nancy will talk about recommendations. Next slide, please. So, as Nick mentioned, we had basically 3 clumps of topics. Foster care, we had 4 organizations with 5 efforts to change foster care policy. 1 that focused on justice and juvenile justice issues. And the remaining ones were involved in mental health and systems of care. And one of the things that we heard from respondents was, from several people, was that how important the system of care funding and the system of care expansion grants and the system of care, what's the last thing called? The infrastructure. Well, the whole infrastructure, but the funding that they got after they were finished. How useful that was in being able to establish and maintain and support youth-led organizations. Next slide, please. Next slide, please.
Which is the one you want?
Oh, it is. All right. Almost all organizations met or exceeded their expectations. And as you heard from Bree, it depends on when you're talking about. At first it was very exciting, and then it all kind of crumbled. 7 of the 9 organizations that we interviewed achieved their goals, and 2 groups are still now working to make the changes that they want. Next slide, please. So we asked the youth organizations what their outcomes were, and then we asked them to rate on a 1 to 4 scale whether this was the outcome that they wanted. From not at all, somewhat, on target, to number 4, exceeded our expectations. And these are just a sample of the many quotations that we got about those responses. The first one up there says, I think it was a 5. This is 5 on a 1 to 4 scale. I would definitely say that it exceeded our expectations if we had any. It was hard making the manual and getting approvals, but when it's all said and done, the fact that we are training people who go into agencies, not just random people who want to be peers, I would say exceeded definitely. Nope, somebody thought it was perfect, a 4. It's hard to answer that because we have so many goals. It's hard to separate out as one goal. The target is to completely change the system. And then exceeded our expectations, but now with what happened, it was a bummer.
And now we will turn this over to Nicholas, who will talk about obstacles to policy change.
So there were many obstacles that the youth organizations encountered. We broke the obstacles down into 3 major categories: people and attitudes, managing the process, and system challenges. Next slide, please. People and attitudes. There were people who didn't believe that youth could be successful to make positive change. They disrespected the youth, were skeptical, had low professional commitment, and resisted youth efforts. In opposition to the youth movement, people said things like, when are these kids going to get a job? And no, peer support will never happen. There's too much risk. They're going to party and all kinds of boundary violations. Next slide, please. Managing the process. There were common language problems, disagreement among partners, discouraging setbacks, slow progress, and communication barriers. One group we interviewed told us there were sometimes different wording than from what us common folks speak sometimes. Another group had said, it is a situation of being disencouraged. Next slide, please. Lastly, system challenges. There were sustainability problems, low resources, barriers to youth participation, and need for large-scale change. One group told us about the limited resources that they had, saying, being pulled in different directions is not easy for her or the rest of the leadership staff. Another group had said, when your boss says do X, and I say I have to check with 30 youth across the state, it causes problems. Next slide, please. Similar to how we broke the obstacles down into categories, we also examined the key aspects that made organizations successful and broke them down. These ingredients for success helped each organization meet their goals. They include relationships with partners, support of the umbrella organization, champions, and youth input and involvement. Next slide, please. Relationship with partners. Organizations were more successful if they could partner with groups of people outside of their own organization. We had one group that partnered with a community college who told us, we were huge partners with a community college. They were coming down and testifying in support of the bill and sharing their experience. Next slide, please. Support of the umbrella organization. Out of the 9 organizations, only 2 were their own 501c3. The rest operated under an umbrella organization, like Children First for Oregon Foster Youth Connection. Some of the umbrella organizations helped to fund the youth organizations, and many provided them with guidance. We had one group that said, our parent organization provided us with a lot of insight as far as what their intentions were with the organization, how they wanted to help. Next slide, please. Champions. Organizations had more success when they could rely on someone of particular influence to guide them through the system or ignite the conversation toward change. We found that some organizations had champions with legislature, telling us, we have friends in the legislature, or champions we call them. They are passionate about child welfare issues and children's issues, so we know who to go to. Next slide, please. Lastly, youth input and involvement. Probably the most important. The youth were probably the most important ingredient for success. We found that since these are issues and policies that directly affect the youth, then these youth must be at the table to drive the conversation. Every organization we interviewed expressed the importance of youth input and involvement, with one organization saying, just having youth on board and listening to their opinions and voices, that is what I believe is the most important component. If you don't have a youth voice on board when it is a policy towards youth, then what is going on? And now I'll move it on to Nancy Korloff, as she'll tell us more about the recommendations.
So we're going to move through these recommendations rather quickly. You will probably not have time to read all the quotes, but we want to have a little time for questions. This is the overview of the recommendations. We have 5 areas that we're covering here. Next slide. So we heard very often in our interviews how important it was to prepare the young adults for the work before sending them out to do whatever kind of policy change they were going to do. And the first quote, I think, underscores what you've heard earlier. And sometimes the environment isn't so friendly, and sometimes people make really rude comments. And so one way of preparing youth and young adults is to help them recognize that this might happen and how they might want to handle it. Some organizations did some post-discussion as well about some of the comments. The second quote, we always prepare them, and it describes in the third quote also the kind of general kinds of information that they felt young people should have before they go talk to someone about a policy change. Next slide. Building relationships. We've talked a lot about relationships throughout this. It can be both an obstacle and also an ingredient for success. and many of the interviewees told us about strong relationships they had with state or county providers or administrators and how important that was, especially to be able to ask for clarification and to ask questions. Next slide. And we've said this throughout, but the critical nature of that the youth stories bring to the policy change process needs to be underscored. And these two quotes, I think, really tell you that. The stories, trust the stories, that the stories are really critical to any piece of legislation. And the second one comes from an experience a young adult group had with a representative who said, you guys have to come to talk to us because we have no ideas what you have been through. You have to talk to legislators so we actually know what's going on. All we see is numbers on the paper. Next slide. Don't give up. And I'm sure many of you have said this same thing. As one legislator said, it's going to take constant, relentless advocacy in order to make the changes you want to make. And so the concept that it's very slow and you just can't give up, you have to keep going and stay focused, comes up fairly regularly. Next slide, please. And choose your battles wisely. Several of the organizations described for us making decisions about which issue to go with first, and understanding that some issues are going to be really tough and may take several years to get any change. And the third quote there where they said, we decided to fix normalcy. This was making living in a foster home a little more normal, and not try to get rid of group homes all at the same time. That we chose, we knew that addressing issues with group homes was going to be a tougher battle, so we did normalcy first. So I think it's making those kinds of choices. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to turn it over to Bree, and Bree, ask you if you'd like to comment on any of those recommendations from your experience with many organizations, and then you can perhaps give a little information about these resources.
Great, thank you so much, Nancy. I think the recommendations for engaging young adults in policy work are really right on, especially depending if young people are engaging in organizational policy change or if they're really advancing that to kind of a state level for legislation. Oftentimes we forget that it's a developmental process for young adults. One, to be engaged as an advocate and a leader within the mental health or the systems work, whether that be child welfare or juvenile justice. And as part of that developmental process, to be able to advise and share their stories, which young people mentioned were so critical for the policymakers to really hear. There really needs to be a lot of support and preparation. And so really thinking about when is a young adult ready to step into kind of that policy arena on how to connect their story to creating that change. And so that's an individual process. And then as a youth group or youth-run organization, kind of what does that look like as a collective process? And so relationships are critical, and some folks may have stronger relationships than others. And so how do you really navigate the relationships that you have to help you move forward with the change? It's really important when we think of preparing young people to share that story and really understand their role at making those higher policy changes. So what you see are some resources that Youth Move National often kind of sends out to those that are seeking support to engage young people or help prepare young people in policy and practice change. And so one of the things that we have at Youth Move National have been getting a lot of requests on where can we get training and where can we get more resources to really take the local youth group or youth organization work outside of just a local county and really bring that to the state level. And so we have several of our Youth Move chapters that are actually hosted within national NAMI chapters across the country. And NAMI National has a wonderful curriculum that if you have a local NAMI chapter, in your community, you can kind of search their website to find a trainer, but they have a really great grassroots curriculum that specifically helps prepare youth and families for how to share their story and then how that applies specifically to kind of that legislative policy, that higher level policy change. And so that is a wonderful resource for people that are looking at providing training and education and may not feel that they have that resource internally on their staff to do, that you could reach out and partner with a NAMI organization to provide that change for you. The others are really kind of toolkits that really talk about how you would engage and the reasons why and value added. Much of what you heard today, which resulted in the findings of this particular policy, really fall in alignment with a lot of the best practices that are in the resources that you see that you can download and review or utilize with the youth groups that you're affiliated with to continue advancing your policy piece. I cannot stress enough that young people who join in on these efforts to be a leader in their community and to try to create change, it can be very frustrating for them because they don't see that instant gratification of the change happening. And so always supporting them and coaching them and helping them to kind of see the small increments of change over time and celebrating the successes along the way, because the journey definitely, it takes time. But it's very rewarding as a collective group that you're able to say, we once had an idea about creating change in our community, and these are the steps we took to see that change. And I've had an opportunity with many of the youth move programs and the young adult organizations that Nicholas mentioned that were interviewed for this. I've had a wonderful opportunity to either work with them or talk to them and kind of celebrate in their success of kind of where their policy pieces are. And it's really exciting when you're able to connect all those dots.
So let's move to the next.
Said, I'll turn it to you, Nancy.
Okay, I just took over. Let's move to the next slide, and Bree, see if there's anything on here you want to comment on. These are some more resources, some of which Barbara added.
No, these are all ours.
Okay. These are some additional resources, and Barbara, you may have something you want to say here. I just want to remind you, as you look at these, that if you have a question that you'd like us to respond to about anything we've presented here, or anything about young adults and policy change, you need to go to the chat or the question function on your screen and write it in, and we will move to questions in just a few minutes. Barbara, so did Nancy, you want to? Yeah.
Nancy, can I just add one thing? If you look at the bottom of this more resources, there's a document at the bottom that Youth Move National put out called What Helps, What Harms. And for those of you that said that you support a youth organization or are not connected but know about a youth organization, that's a national policy initiative we did with young people where they conducted their own listening and focus group sessions that really looked at what was helpful within the systems in which they were involved in and what was harmful about their interaction with the system. And each state created their own mini report, and then that was compiled nationally to identify themes of what is most useful for youth and young adults who are accessing helping and supportive systems, and what was harmful. So if you are not connected to a youth organization but you want to know more about kind of that national perspective and what your state information was, that might be a great resource for you to start, and then you can get connected to the local chapter that might have conducted some of that.
Thanks.
No, I actually don't have much. This is sort of a mixture of some policy manual types and also the two from the Bazelon Center. The first one is just an analysis of federal programs that fund services. It's just sort of an example of a collection of federal policies and programs that are connected to transition age youth. And then the second one is all about how the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, which is a policy, how that is helping to create integrated housing opportunities for people with mental illness. But these all, I just want to remind you, these all can also be downloaded as a PDF. You can download these slides so that you can look at them at your leisure. I know we've been going fast.
So we wanted to answer all your questions, so keep them rolling in. And as we move to that, I just want to pause for a minute and see if any of the panelists here have anything they'd like to comment on that they weren't able to get to. Barbara's got her hands raised.
Yes, I just wanted to say that in addition to preparing people by rehearsing for testimony, by rehearsing, and also we did get a lot of information about how important it was to remember that for example, if young people are going to go give testimony at the legislature, they may need help with getting appropriate clothing. They need transportation, per diem, buy lunch, child care, scheduling. Often legislative hearings are set. There's no way to schedule around them. But I just think it's important also that there are lots of what seem like mundane but are really crucial things that help get people ready to make those kind of contacts and relationships.
And I suppose if I had anything to add, since we have a little bit of extra time, I just wanted to say that aside from being a research assistant at Portland State, I'm also a young adult with lived experience. 5 years ago, I went through my first psychosis, and it's really been grateful or helpful to have a community like PSU and a youth organization called the Early Assessment and Support Alliance that have helped me grow into the person that I am now and further in the future that I want to become. And so I think the culture of helping people that have been through the system is really, it's authentic and it's true, and it's coming more and more prevalent that people with lived experience are getting in the work and getting involved. I just wanted to add that.
Thanks, Dave. Yes, well, we don't have too many questions. We don't have any questions coming in. So if anybody wants to just make a comment about anything we've said, we'd love to have that too. You have to go to the chat line or question line on the dashboard, and then you can enter it there. While we're waiting to see if there are any comments, I just wanted to mention one of the things we became much more fully aware of was what's going on in foster care or in the child welfare area around youth and young adult engagement in policy. And we received many more nominations of foster youth organizations than we were actually able to interview. We were trying to keep the focus more on mental health, but many, I think every state now, because of federal legislation, has a young adult organization or some group of young adults that are being supported to either make policy change or at least be advisors, and maybe that's a better around foster care policies. So that's another resource that if you haven't been able to connect with that organization in your state, that may be a resource that you'd want to go to.
And of course, foster care and mental health are not separate silos necessarily, not for young people.
And we have a comment here that just came in to Nicholas, and it says, "Great work, Nicholas, from a young person with 21 years of lived experience." So thank you for that comment. We think Nicholas does great work as well.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
He keeps us honest and kind of on track, which we very much appreciate and need.
I appreciate you two as well.
Okay, John, is there anything else we need to do here?
Well, the next slide was basically comments, question, and discussion, and we've reminded folks throughout the webinar that we are going to be making the recording and the actual PDFs of the slides available at the Pathways website very shortly after this, so that they can download them and look at them at their leisure. Beyond that, I think we should invite folks to be in touch with our panelists should they have any questions. I'm not sure if there's any more from our panelists beyond that.
Now, we just encourage, certainly the three of us here at Portland State, we'd be happy to answer questions by email, particularly or offline, about the study. There's a lot more data and information than we were able to present here. We also just want to thank the 9 organizations that participated with us and gave their time and their energy. And we want to thank Bree particularly, both for being an interviewee and helping us get to the right people in Maine, and also for being on this webinar with us. I think that's it.
All right, great. Well, and if there are any other questions that need to come in, we have email addresses here on the screen. And I just wanted to thank, again, the panel for all the time and effort they put into preparing this presentation. And just remind you again that all of the webinar materials will be published online shortly at our website. And that's basically all for today. Thank you all for attending.
I wish we could hear you clap.
The thunder slide?